as soon as they're done with the streaming technology.
Okay, great, thank you.
Pardon me, Rebecca. Alexia is in the process of applying to UT Law.
Very nice to meet you.
She's one of our outstanding pre-law
Oh,
students.
wonderful, that's great, yeah.
I'm really interested. I'm trying to get over there to see one of his classes, but I have class, so I gotta work it out with my professor here.
Oh,
But
yeah.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to the
Oh,
process.
great.
And it was a
Let me know
pleasure to
when
meet
you're
you.
coming, and stop by.
Yeah, of course,
Turn
of
around.
course. It was
Yeah.
great to meet you. I'm
Great to
excited
meet you
listen
too.
to the discussion as well.
Great.
To listen to the discussion as well.
You have that because it's exited out for some reason. It should still be going. Try to stop streaming off once it's over. Perfect. There you go. Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
So I haven't got my score back. I did back in 2015. And then I was actually planning to meet. Well, I'm going to like judge, but he did pretty well for sure. Yeah. Oh, the prep was amazing. He was great. Yeah. And then they prepared me. Yeah. Yes, we will.
Hey, how's it going? You go by John or Sam? Sam. Go by Sam, all right? Yeah. You know you're listed on all the paperwork. That's all right. I got it, Sam. Yeah, so.
Yes, we're live streaming right now, so Sammy, if you regret.
No, we're on, fair warning, Rebecca, we're on hot mic right now.
Okay. Quiet. What's your sort of early? I wish they started. They're already here.
They'll probably be more comfortable.
Okay. Yep.
Those hard questions? Success in the classroom. Because they do a little learn about how to be successful in the classroom. So I just think on campus, like you guys like college, they have no ability to oh yeah, I'll be fine. Yeah, I'm good. Actually,
I remember the name of the show we watched, BuzzFeed Unsolved.
BuzzFeed?
BuzzFeed Unsolved.
The news outlet?
Yeah, exactly.
With Chase Phillips.
Yeah.
My wife.
They definitely had a great episode of Charleston.
And, you know, if you watch anything, because I'll recommend it to my wife.
Oh, yeah, it's fun.
BuzzFeed.
BuzzFeed Unsolved.
BuzzFeed Unsolved. You hear it?
Yeah. So, and if you have, do you watch any of those shows? Have you?
I mean, I understand she's the producer.
That's great. And so we reported that tour guide right now, I have to provide batteries for my EMF detector.
Do you like the any of those story movies too?
Oh, yeah.
Like Paranormal Activity. Those I really like.
Ones that are really scary that I don't like.
The Haunting of Shirley Jackson.
Oh, that is
one of the best movies I've ever seen.
That's scary.
She was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And I think that movie did her justice. Robert Wise.
Okay, I'll have to try. Yes, I have seen that one. Yeah, I've seen that one. Yep.
I'm getting shivers just thinking.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it may be standing room only.
This is a great problem. There's a few people here right now.
In the back, we've got some seats up here. If you like Grant, Logan, we've got Armani, we've got some seats up here. I'm sorry, yeah, up here. You're welcome. You're welcome to come down. We've got 3 up here.
I promise I won't call on you. Socratic method.
There's one right here. I think there's one right. Oh, is there one? Is that taken? And you got right here.
I'll book down one. You have enough? You have enough spots? Anyone else?
I think we got comfort. Right. Absolutely. Logan, Riley, we got 2 seats up here if you'd like.
People in the.
One right here.
3 more chairs. There is on Halloween a debate about standardized testing. And,
talk will be about half an hour. Okay, yeah, it's probably about 20 minutes. Okay.
All right, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nathan Getting, Director of the George W. Romney Institute for Law and Public Policy. Thank you for attending this afternoon's Philip J. Prigosky Constitution Day Address. I'd like to especially thank President Docking, Vice Presidents Milner and Rebar, Deans Koumandoros and Gordon for the support they've shown the Romney Institute. Today's event wouldn't be possible without it. And I'd also like to especially thank Romney Institute intern Chancey Boyce, who helped put today's event together. His support was invaluable as well. Before we begin, a word about the namesake of tonight's event. Philip J. Prigosky served as an administrative law judge for the State of Michigan Board of Licensing and Regulation, but it was the 35 years he spent teaching constitutional law at Thomas M. Cooley Law School, mentoring countless future lawyers and judges as they learned our nation's founding document. That was his life's work. 12 years ago, actually 13 years ago now, pardon me, he provided invaluable support to the Romney Institute during the critical stages of its infancy. Not only was he the Institute's first guest speaker, delivering a bravura first Constitution Day address in 2010, he was also a constant source of wise counsel. Soon after that event, Professor Prigosky suffered a debilitating stroke while engaged in the craft he had mastered better than nearly anyone else, teaching constitutional law. In 2019, he passed away. To help perpetuate Professor Prigosky's legacy of curiosity and examination of the Constitution, the Romney Institute has invited Rebecca Zitlow to deliver today's address. Dean Zitlow has earned many impressive titles throughout her distinguished career in legal education. She's currently the interim dean, distinguished university professor, and the Charles W. Fornoff Professor of Law and Values at the University of Toledo College of Law. She's a renowned author, an expert on the Constitution's Civil War amendments and abolitionism, about which she spoke here on campus not long ago. It's a thrill to have her back. Tonight's address is titled Democracy in the United States Supreme Court. I can't imagine a topic more timely or important. Please join me in welcoming Dean Rebecca Zitmo.
Thank you so much, Professor Getting. Thank you so much for inviting me here, and also to Vice President Milner, to President Docking, and to all of the rest of you here. I've grown to love Adrian College. Our law school has a special relationship with all of you. We have some of our favorite students are from your school, so it's really a pleasure to be here today to be able to talk with you about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, something that I think about all the time as a constitutional law professor and a historian and a believer, someone who strongly believes in democracy. So today I'm going to talk to you about the United States Supreme Court and start all over again, sorry. Today I'm going to talk to you about the United States Supreme Court's role in our democracy. Now, democracy is defined as government by the people, especially the rule of the majority. It's essential to our national identity, and it's the reason why our nation exists. Our revolution was against the English king, who imposed his tyrannical rule without participation of the people, a concentration of power in one person, against which our forefathers rebelled to create our country. The U.S. Constitution sets up the framework for our democracy and lays out a separation of powers and system of federalism to make sure that power is distributed between the branches and between the federal government and the states in a way to prevent the kind of tyrannical rule that our forefathers rebelled against. President Abraham Lincoln called the Constitution a picture of silver surrounding the apple of gold. With the apple of gold to President Lincoln was the Declaration of Independence and the promise of self-governance and rights protections that were in that Declaration of Independence. But the Supreme Court has a unique amount of power over the branches and over the states that I'm going to talk about. As we celebrate the Constitution today on Constitution Day, it's essential that the court use its constitutional power to further democracy consistently with the framework that the Constitution has set up and not to undermine it. So today I'm going to talk about three important cases in United States history in which the court has stepped in to affect the democratic process during a time of conflict and division in our country. The Dred Scott versus Sandford case, decided in 1857, shortly before our Civil War. Cooper versus Aaron, decided in 1958, in the midst of the civil rights movement, and as one of the catalysts and supporters of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And Trump versus United States, decided this summer at a time of polarized division in our country with a highly contested, when we're in the midst of a highly contested election. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about how the Supreme Court fits within our constitutional structure and some just very basic constitutional principles that you may have already learned about in your high school civics class, or if you take any classes here in college as well, and that is the federal government, that power is distributed amongst the branches of the federal government, with the legislature, Congress making the laws, the executive branch and the president executing the laws, and the judiciary, the judicial branch, interpreting the laws. And so the power is spread out, and one of the things I teach in my Common Law 1 class is that the central rule is no branch can perform the function of another branch, and no branch can unduly interfere with or impede the function of another branch. In addition to our separation of powers, we also have our Constitution distributes power in our system of federalism. So we have the federal government on the top here, with the legislative, judicial, and executive branches all in the federal government, and then we have the states here down below. Now, there's a reason why the federal government is on top and the states below, and that's because of a provision in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause that says that federal law is supreme over state law whenever there is a conflict between federal law and state law. Now, so far, you can see that the judicial branch of the United States Supreme Court, which is the ultimate court of the federal government, you see where it is. It's in the midst of those three branches here and in the slide before that. And notice that, and I'm going to go back, let's see if I can do this, to the other branch, to this other slide here. Notice that the judicial branch is the only branch of the three branches that is not elected by the people, right? It's the only branch that is not elected. Of course, the legislature is directly elected by the people. The president is elected through the Electoral College, was not directly elected, but still is chosen by the people. And of course, the president has a unique role because he or she is the only federal official who is chosen by the entire people of the United States, but through the Electoral College. But the judiciary is not elected. The federal judiciary is appointed by the president, and appointments must be approved by the Senate. So the judiciary is appointed by the other branches. But once the federal judges are appointed, they have lifetime job security. It's a great job. I always tell my students, this is the best job for a lawyer because you have lifetime job security unless you are impeached for committing a high crime or misdemeanor, just like the president. And Congress can't reduce your salaries because they get mad at you, because the Constitution prohibits that from happening. Congress cannot reduce their salaries while they're in office. So federal judges are insulated from the political process. I'll talk about how that can be a good thing. But first, I'm going to point out to you that means that federal judges, including and especially the justices on the United States Supreme Court, are not accountable to the people. If we get angry, if the people don't like a decision that's issued by the Supreme Court, there's nothing we can do about it, except if it's a constitutional decision. There's really nothing we can do except try to amend the Constitution. And it's very hard to amend the Constitution. We've only done it 26 times in over 200 years, so that gives you a sense of how hard it is to amend the Constitution. So that lack of accountability by the court means that every time the Supreme Court strikes down an act of a coordinate branch or an elected state official, its actions carry a presumption of invalidity. This is really important because it's also true that all federal officials, president, members of Congress, and all state officials swear an oath to the Constitution. And so their acts are presumed to be constitutional. And yet the court has taken on itself, as I will explain, the role of having a veto over any other branch's determination of what is constitutional, which is what makes the court, in fact, the most powerful branch, at least in terms of saying what the law means and what the law of the entire country is. So the court, when it acts, it's really using an awesome power, and it must justify its actions. All right. As early as Marbury versus Madison, the court said, and this is a very early case, the first Supreme Court, Chief Supreme Court Justice, Justice Marshall, said that the judiciary has the power to determine the constitutionality of the executive branch and of the legislative branch. And the same court ruled that the court has the power to determine the constitutionality of the acts of the state governments as well. That's why I'm saying the judicial branch is the most powerful branch. The judicial branch is not commander-in-chief of the army and doesn't have the power of the purse like Congress, but they have the power to strike down the acts of both Congress and the president, and as I said, state governments, which is what is an awesome power. So I'm going to talk now about 3 cases where the court exercised this awesome power that are very controversial cases in our nation's history, in part because they all happened at times, as I said before, of political division and and strife in our country. And the first case I'm going to talk about is the Dred Scott case. This is my judicial review slide there. See, the Supreme Court jumped up to being on top of Congress and the executive branch. All right. So this is this picture of Dred Scott. He was an enslaved man who was held in slavery in Missouri, in the state of Missouri. At the time that Dred Scott was alive, our nation was divided by the issue of slavery. Slavery was legal in the southern states and illegal by 1850 in the northern states. Slavery, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 established that with all those western territories that were out there, that any new territory south of the Mason-Dixon line would have slaves, would be a slave state. Any territory north of the Mason-Dixon line would be a free state. Well, that compromise and all other compromises over slavery were failed compromises. The anti-slavery movement grew, began actually at the time of our revolution, then gained momentum in the 1840s and 1850s. And this is what I talked about in my talk when I came here a few years ago, as well as conflicts generated by fugitives from slavery crossing over borders into northern states, where many people tried to stop southern slave catchers from capturing them and bringing them back home. In fact, a number of people in the North, including not just anti-slavery activists, but also northern state officials, argued that if a person was able to cross, an enslaved person was able to cross into a northern state, they became free. The freedom principle was known as. And they argued that that was the case. And some enslaved people actually filed lawsuits and won those lawsuits. And that's the kind of lawsuit that Dred Scott was trying to bring, because he didn't escape, but he traveled with his master to the free state of Illinois and to the free territory of Minnesota. And he filed a lawsuit arguing that he was now a free person. He was no longer enslaved because he had traveled into this free territory. Now, as I said, this was consistent with the beliefs of many in the anti-slavery movement, and some of the lower courts have ruled in favor of other plaintiffs like Scott. But you can imagine why this was such a crucially important case in the late 1850s. Because if the court ruled in favor of Dred Scott, that was going to mean that lots more people were going to be coming over the borders, and the people in the states where slavery was legal already felt extremely threatened by the anti-slavery movement and extremely afraid of slave rebellions. So much so that they had, okay, I'm getting off on a tangent. Now I'm thinking, this is what I've let. Let's get back to this case. The Supreme Court issued an opinion against Scott. The Supreme Court at the time was dominated by justices from slave states, including Justice Roger Taney, who was the Chief Justice who wrote the main opinion of Dred Scott. And in that opinion, that's right. And in that opinion, Justice Taney said that Black people were not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizen in the Constitution. Now, this was important to the case because only U.S. citizens could sue in federal court under diversity as a jurisdictional issue. So this was a legal question that was important to the case, but it was obviously also extremely dehumanizing to people of African descent in the United States. Justice Taney said people of African descent were never intended to be part of the people that were protected by the U.S. Constitution. And what he also said is that Congress did not have any power to do anything about this because there was a fundamental right to own enslaved people. The right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. What that meant is that Congress couldn't do anything to resolve this conflict that was happening, that was getting worse and worse and more tensions. Because Congress could not abolish slavery. Congress couldn't regulate slavery because slaveholders had a fundamental right to own slaves. And so the court took this issue out of the political process completely, disempowered the political branches from doing anything about the problem of slavery. And many historians believe that the Dred Scott opinion contributed significantly to what happened only 2 years later, which was our country erupting into civil war. It radicalized the anti-slavery movement because what was the point, what else can you do? John Brown, right, the raid on Harper's Ferry, because there was no other way to solve the slavery problem. Now, Justice Taney thought that the Dred Scott opinion would decide the issue of slavery once and for all in this country. He believed that the Supreme Court pronouncement would, the court said what the law is, and now we're going to go home, and everything's going to be fine. We're not going to have any fights anymore about slavery. Anti-slavery members of Congress derided the Dred Scott opinion. They argued that it was a political opinion reflecting the will of then President James Buchanan, who was a Northern pro-slavery Democrat. They accused Buchanan of having written part of the opinion, and they argued that it had no effect at all as law. And that was one of the things that, for those of you that are familiar with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, this is one of the things that Lincoln talked about, that they talked about in this case. So, in Dred Scott, the court stepped into the middle of a polarized political debate, sought to end the debate once and for all with its ruling that Congress could not abolish slavery or do anything to abolish slavery, but by foreclosing any political solution to the debate, the court undermined democracy and contributed to a war that almost ended our country. As a strong-arm use of judicial power to protect the heinous institution of slavery, Dred Scott is almost universally known as one of the very worst opinions ever issued by the United States Supreme Court. Now, after we had the Civil War, and after the national government, the Union won the war, Congress acted, and our country adopted, to amend our Constitution to create rights, to end slavery and to create rights for formerly enslaved people and other people. So with the 13th Amendment, abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment, citizenship and privileges or immunities of citizenship clause, overturned the Dred Scott opinion. So it's one of 3 examples of Congress acting to amend the Constitution expressly to overturn a Supreme Court decision. And the birthright citizenship created by the Citizenship Clause overturned Justice Taney's ruling that people of African descent could not be U.S. citizens. And the Equal Protection Clause requires the equal protection of the law and prohibits race discrimination by state actors. And the 15th Amendment prohibits states from discriminating in the franchise, depriving people of the right to vote based on their race. But unfortunately, our country tired of the conflict and failed to enforce these rights, protecting provisions after Reconstruction ended when the Northern troops pulled out in the mid-1870s. Our country devolved into a racially segregated society in which formerly enslaved people, their descendants, and other persons of color were treated as second-class citizens. And in the Jim Crow South, states prohibited Black people from voting, blatantly violating the 14th and 15th Amendments, and enacted many laws that imposed racial segregation and economic disempowerment on people of color. Southern states also looked away when terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan committed violence against Black people who tried to vote or asserted their rights in any other way. And in the rest of the country, things were a little bit better, but still pretty bad. Still second-class citizenship, still rampant race discrimination and discouragement of voting by people of color. After the Second World War, a civil rights movement for racial equality began in the North and spread to the South. And in 1954, the Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling, one of the most important rulings that it's ever issued, Brown versus Board of Education, in which the court held that state-mandated segregation of public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And in a series of cases following Brown, the Supreme Court expanded that ruling to any state action that was race-based and discriminatory. The reaction in southern states was swift and hostile. What historians refer to as massive resistance. Many Southern members of Congress issued a Southern manifesto accusing the Supreme Court of abusing its power. Southern state legislatures passed measures condemning the court's ruling and vowing to resist it. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, and other districts throughout the South, Black students sued the local Board of Education to enforce the Brown ruling and end segregation in Little Rock public schools. A federal district court judge agreed and ordered the school district to allow Black children to attend schools that had formerly been all white. And what you see in the picture here is a group of high school students known as the Little Rock Nine. These were the 9 brave young men and women who volunteered to be the first people to desegregate the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus not only refused to follow the ruling of the district court, but called out the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the African American students from entering the school. This ruling was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and in a unanimous opinion signed by all 9 Supreme Court justices, one of the only opinions, it might actually be the only opinion where they've ever done that. The United States Supreme Court ordered the state governor to follow the district court ruling and the Brown ruling. In Cooper versus Aaron, the court held that the federal judiciary is supreme in the exposition of the law of the Constitution. Remember I talked about the Supremacy Clause earlier? here the court's saying not only the Constitution itself, but what we say the Constitution means is supreme. And and everybody in the country, all state actors, all government officials have to follow this, including the governor of the state of Arkansas. It was one of the strongest assertions of judicial supremacy in the history of our country. The court says, goes on to say, the interpretation of the 14th Amendment enunciated by this court in Brown is the supreme law of the land. Now, to ensure that the court's ruling in Cooper was followed, President Dwight Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, the soldiers of which who had protected the Little Rock, soldiers of which who had excluded the Little Rock Nine, now protected them as they attended school in the year following the Supreme Court ruling. Once again, federal troops in the South protecting individual rights and ensuring that the Supreme Court rulings would be followed. Now, the court's ruling in Brown and its super ruling in Cooper were criticized, not only by Southern segregationists, but also prominent members of the legal academy who accused the court of judicial activism, using its power to achieve political goals. Some of the most prominent Harvard Law School professor, Herbert Wechsler, said that I agree, I also think segregation is good, but the Supreme Court is just being political here. It's not playing its proper role. And so the question was, how can you just, if you hate Dred Scott, where the court stepped into the political process at a very polarized time and made a ruling, how can you like Cooper? Is there any way to justify Brown and Cooper, that exercise? And that's where we get back to what I said at the beginning of class. The court acts in an is always acting in an anti-democratic way whenever it strikes down the laws or any actions of the other branches or of state officials. There must be a justification for it. And the justification that scholars came up with as they interpreted, because I would say after Cooper, the Warren Court continued to issue landmark ruling after landmark ruling, enforcing voting rights of Black people and other people of color, enforcing the Equal Protection Clause against other state segregation, and ensuring that schools actually did followed the Brown ruling and desegregated. And there's a long story. We could go on and on about that. In fact, we could spend a whole semester talking about how that didn't all really work out so well. But the point is that the argument that scholars came up with to explain why Cooper was good, Brown was good, even though Dred Scott is bad, is that when the court was acting to enforce the rights of racial equality of people who had historically been discriminated against, they were acting to protect the rights of repeat losers in the political process. The political process had failed for the Little Rock Nine and other African American children in southern states, and their parents for that matter, because they were not able to participate in that political process because their right to vote had been taken away from them. And also because they were in the numerical minority. So that when the court acts to protect what the court referred to as discrete and insular minorities from the failures of the political process, that is a justifiable use of the Supreme Court power. In other words, the court is acting to promote democracy, acting to improve democracy, acting to protect people for whom democracy had failed from the tyranny of the majority. And in this case, the insulation of politics of the courts was the strength of the courts as rights protectors. Because federal judges, especially in southern states, that were enforcing the Brown mandate, enforcing laws, federal laws, civil rights laws, even if the people around them didn't like it, they couldn't be kicked out of office. Whereas state judges are mostly elected and were very reluctant, right, to act against the desires of the people around them. Federal judges insulated from power. So this is the justification for the court, and I agree with this. When the court acts to promote democracy, when it uses its power, that is a good way for the court to use its power. And when I went to law school in the late 1980s, that was a widely accepted argument. And that was what the court had done. At the same time as the court was acting, so was the political process. So the civil rights movement moved the people of the United States. This is, of course, the 1963 I Have a Dream March. Both of these pictures are here with Martin Luther King and all the other activists on the ground all over the country, and especially in southern states. So that Congress enacted laws such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits race discrimination in places of privately owned places of public accommodation. There is President Johnson signing that act, you can see, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so that all three branches, Congress enacted the laws, the Johnson administration enforced them, and all three branches worked together to further racial equality and promote a multiracial democracy. Unfortunately, however, the current Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Roberts, has strayed from its role for protecting our constitutional democracy and the rights of minorities in that democracy. Instead, the court has repeatedly issued rulings that undermine democracy and undermine congressional efforts to fix flaws in our democratic system. A couple of cases that you may have heard of this one, Citizens United versus FEC, where the court struck down a provision of the Campaign Finance Act, limiting the amount of money that a corporation could spend for a political campaign, thus opening the floodgates for the, $1 billion presidential elections. I mean, this year might, I think, cost $1 billion, or more than $1 billion between the two candidates. A lesser known, but in my opinion, one of the worst cases ever, is Shelby County versus Holder, where the court struck down provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that had proactive measures to protect voting rights of people who lived in parts of the country which had historically deprived people of color from voting rights. And as soon as this decision came down, those states started enacting more laws restricting the rights to vote of people that had at least a disproportionate impact on people of color, if not intentionally discriminating against them. But the last case that I want to talk about is a Roberts Court case, and this is the case of this year, Trump versus United States. The court issued an opinion which could drastically undermine our democratic system and the constitutional structure to protect it. In Trump versus United States, former President Donald Trump is being, and many other people were also prosecuted, but he is being prosecuted for his role in a violent insurrection, which occurred on January 26, 2021. Previous November, the President Trump had been defeated in the presidential election, but he refused to concede defeat. Instead, he and his allies spread unsubstantiated rumors about the election, claiming he had actually won and the election had been stolen by voter fraud. None of these claims were ever proven, but on January 6th, the day that Congress assembled to count the electoral votes and declare Joe Biden the winner, Trump held a rally in which you all know this. He repeated his claims about election fraud, urged his supporters to go to Capitol. Our mob, consisting in part of the people who had attended the rally, stormed the Capitol, threatened to kill the vice president, and attacked law enforcement officers who got in their way. Note this, for the first time ever in our nation's history, those rioters that carried the Confederate flag through the halls of Congress. And for those of us that study Reconstruction, that was pretty chilling, because we remember how during the Civil War, this was President Abraham Lincoln's worst nightmare. Because, of course, Washington, D.C. is right on the border of Virginia. They were afraid, they were worried the Confederate troops would come and invade, but that never did happen during the Civil War, but this flag was carried through. Now, many criminal prosecutions followed, including the prosecution of former President Trump, who argued that he could not be prosecuted because as president, he was immune from prosecution from his acts. Lower courts rejected Trump's arguments because they conflicted with years of judicial precedent. The Supreme Court took the case, and an opinion that shocked constitutional law experts this summer sided with former President Trump. The court held that the president was absolutely immune from prosecution for his official acts during his presidency, a breathtakingly broad ruling that enables any president to order his staff to commit crimes with impunity. The court's opinion is directly contrary to earlier precedents on the accountability of presidents in the criminal process. The opinion is not supported by the text of the Constitution. I already said it was against precedent, and it is against the original meaning of the Constitution, which, as we discussed at the beginning of this talk, was to rebel against the king and to ensure that power is distributed and no one person or branch becomes too powerful. Now, the court's opinion is based on policy, not law, the nature of presidential power. If you read the opinion, there is no, as I said, there is no text, there is no precedent, and there is no original meaning to support the court's ruling. Just this week, there was a report in the New York Times, actually it was just a couple of days ago, which reported that Chief Justice Roberts had worked for months behind the scenes to achieve the result in Trump versus United States. Apparently, Chief Justice Roberts thought that this ruling would resolve the ongoing controversy, like Chief Justice Taney, the author of the Dred Scott opinion, who believed that his ruling would resolve the controversy over slavery. In Trump versus the United States, the court exercised its supreme power to prevent one branch of the federal government from any accountability for its actions, even if those actions are criminal. Like the right to enslave people created by the court in Dred Scott, the presidential immunity created by the Roberts courts threatens to undermine our democracy, prohibiting the people of the United States from holding the president accountable. So in conclusion, the Supreme Court is the symbol of the rule of law in our country, the bedrock foundation of our democracy, our constitutional principles. We need the court to act as if democracy matters and not to undermine its promise. Thank you. Happy to answer questions about any, yes?
What's your opinion on them raising the number of justices that they have in the Supreme Court?
Well, I think that would be a good thing. We've had the same number of justices actually since the Civil War. As you know, this is my area of specialty, right? In fact, the Reconstruction Congress did act to change the size of the court three times during the Civil War. They increased the size of the court to 10 when President Lincoln was appointing justices. When when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson was appointed, and he was a Southern pro-slavery Democrat, frankly, very racist, anti-all Reconstruction measures. They reduced the size of the Supreme Court to 7, so he couldn't appoint any more justices, and then they eventually expanded it to 9, where it is now. So this has happened before. Our country is much more complex than it ever has been. We have more circuits than Supreme Court justices have had for a while. So some people have argued that the court should be expanded to the number of circuits, and I agree with that. Yes?
One of the previous talks that was held here was between two lawyers. I don't fully remember their names, but one of the topics was, the topic was about Trump's case here. And one of the arguments was if Trump is found guilty in this, it opens the floodgates for all the other presidents in the future that be brought up to the same charges and all that.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, that is a conjecture that has never happened, right, based on something that's never happened, where actually we have right now a former president who may or may not have committed a crime, we don't know, right? I mean, that is to say the courts haven't decided yet whether, so I think it's kind of, I think that bringing that parade of horribles, assumes the worst about presidents in the future and doesn't address the concern that we have now or the concern about what, as I said before, that's behind our entire Constitution. So I'm not persuaded by that argument. Yes.
I have two questions. I don't
Sure.
think that's fair enough. So the first is about the idea that we can look at the Supreme Court decisions in terms of whether or not they're promoting democracy.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering whether or not you think Roe v. Wade promotes democracy, or overturning Roe v. Wade promotes democracy
Yeah.
by giving it back to the states.
Yeah.
My second question is, what was going on with the authors of the Constitution that they didn't explicitly say who should be interpreting the law in the Constitution?
Yeah.
Right? What happened there? Because they had to have been aware that this is an issue.
Yeah, and I think what your Professor Spence is mentioning here is that judicial review is not in the Constitution. The whole thing we've been talking about this time. So I'll try to answer that one a little bit first. I don't know. But it is true that judicial review had been exercised in the colonies and had been exercised under the Articles of the Confederacy. So it's not, so Marbury versus Madison was not consistent with the text, was consistent with the precedent. And then there's also a separation of powers based argument, which was if the court doesn't have judicial review, it has almost no power at all. So what's the point of it, And we talk about that in our common law classes. Your other question is a very interesting one that I thought about whether I should talk about Dobbs. I considered talking about Dobbs because Dobbs is a complicated, so for those that don't know, you probably all do, but for those that don't know, in 2022, this same court overturned the Roe v. Wade, where the court had held that there's a constitutional right to obtain an abortion, and in the case of Dobbs. And Justice Alito, who wrote the opinion, talked about democracy, sending this back to the democratic process. There's an awful lot of scholarship debating whether Roe v. Wade was the best way to go in protecting abortion rights, because at the time there was an abortion rights movement and states were starting to move, and the argument is, and including people who support abortion rights, say that the court shouldn't have, that when the court acted, then it spurred this counter movement, right? And in fact, in kind of the entire Republican Party today, sort of in a way sprung from Roe. Certainly, Reagan runs with the moral majority, et cetera, and all of that. So one argument would be, yeah, that was the right thing for the court to do. They should have thrown it back to the political process. It goes back to the argument. The counter argument is as follows: that not only does the court have, not only is the court acting correctly to protect the rights of discrete and insular minorities against the majority, but also when that court acts to protect fundamental rights, that's also an appropriate use of the judicial power. And so the people who don't like Dobbs argue that this was a case where there is a fundamental right. When there's a fundamental right, it shouldn't be subject to the whims of the political process. So it's a more complicated case. I agree, and thank you for asking that question. I was thinking about talking about them. Now I got to do that. Thank you. Yes.
So I was thinking about the Trump versus U.S. case, and I mean, obviously we're all familiar with it, and we're all aware that there's a counter argument to it, right? That did Donald Trump actually say anything that was controversial or do anything himself to actually incite a riot, right? That's obviously a counter argument. But when we get down to it, I was wondering, when it comes to the law itself, when it comes to the Supreme Court, right? There is no precedence for prosecuting a former president or any president for that matter. And so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the law is that the judges create precedents. So would this not be an example of the Supreme Court creating precedents for how we should treat a former president, and whether we should, whether they should abide by certain laws or not? Because as far as I know, there's nothing really written about what you should do when it comes to prosecuting or not prosecuting a former president or standing president.
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to make very clear, I want, to the extent that we can, us to divorce the ruling from the facts of the the individual case. I'm not taking a position about whether former President Trump committed a crime or not. What I'm talking about is whether presidents can be held accountable for committing crimes. You're right, no president has ever been prosecuted before. A vice president was. Aaron Burr was prosecuted. And that was very early on when many of the framers of the Constitution were still alive. It's also true that President Gerald Ford pardoned former President Richard Nixon for all crimes he might have committed, which the implication there is that he believed that Nixon, and in fact, a widely shared understanding was that Nixon could have been prosecuted for crimes, and he wanted to end, the nightmare. There's also the precedent of United States versus Nixon at that time, where the court held that the president had to participate and had to turn over the tapes, right? Had to participate in the political process. He was not indicted in that criminal case because he was a sitting president at the time. So they're right. No president has ever been prosecuted for a crime, which goes back to the point where I said earlier, they never have been before. There's no real reason to believe they would be in the future. But the fact that, if they did commit a crime, they should be prosecuted, I think that's consistent with all the fundamental principles I talked about before. Yes?
You said it during the middle part of your speech about the Supreme Court upholding democracy and like the different parts of the government upholding democracy. How do we distinguish when we're upholding democracy and when we're making unethical opinions? Because if 70% of the United States had an unethical opinion, just like we did before with slavery, a lot of Americans during the founding of the nation thought that slavery was okay. So how do we know when we're making an unethical decision that's consensus versus actually upholding true democracy and equality?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, right? That's what it really comes down to. That's sort of the central question of what I'm talking about today. And as I suggested, one way to make the determination is that the court has to be acting to protect people, that the court is acting when the political process is broken, or arguably also to protect fundamental human rights that shouldn't be intruded on. Now, if that's the answer, that still doesn't, we still might disagree about where that applies and where that does not. But it's a constant question that we have to ask. I mean, certainly there's an awful lot of people that thought that the Supreme Court acted in an unethical way when it held that there was a right to obtain an abortion in Roe versus Wade, right? So there's always going to be disagreement about this. And the most we can do is try to figure out what the rules might be, even if we disagree in the application.
I hate to bring the event to a close, but I see that we're actually 2 minutes over our time. Would you please join me in thanking Dean Zitlow?
And thanks for all the great questions, too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Have a great day, everyone.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I gotta run in to teach a youth group, but I really, really appreciate your time
Oh,
today.
thanks for coming. Great.
Going back to class.
Oh my gosh, you have so many classes at night.
Yeah, well,
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding is because the president's
Yes.
because Why can't the president just say you can't say that because
Yeah, that works.
it wasn't a crime? What was the crime?
Well, yeah, exactly.
So is that, am I crazy?
No, I-
Is that- is that
no, I agree
the
with
next
you.
argument that's gonna come down the road with this?
I agree with- yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I mean, what, you know, this Trump and his lawyers have